Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Glasp Talk. Today we are excited to have Gary Rivlin with us, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and acclaimed author whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Wired, and Mother Jones, among many others. And Gary has written 11 books, and his latest, AI Valley, Microsoft, Google, and the $1 trillion race to cash in on artificial intelligence, offers a gripping behind the scenes look at the AI gold rush unfolding in Silicon Valley. A former tech correspondent for the New York Times and a contributor to the Panama Papers, Gary has spent decades at the front line of tech reporting, chronicling everything from the rise of Google and Facebook to the challenges facing small businesses in times of crisis. With his sharp eye for storytelling and a deep understanding of technology's societal impact, Gary brings a powerful lens to one of the most important shifts of our time. And today we will dive into the world of AI Valley to discuss the growing power of big tech and explore what this moment means for the future of innovation in society. Gary, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Oh, thanks for having me. My pleasure.
So first of all, we love your book, AI Valley. It's really insightful. But could you tell us what inspired you to write the book? I heard the main focus in the book is Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn and also co-founder of Inflection AI. But I heard you were going to someone else in the beginning. But, could you tell us the behind the scenes story a little bit? Is that?
Yeah, it was interesting. So it's 2022, and I had taken a break from tech for a while. I wrote a book about small businesses surviving COVID, but I was really drawn back to tech. And actually, I was thinking of a biography of a prominent figure in tech, a controversial figure in tech. And I knew it'd be hard because he was going to be hostile to me writing it. Every interview is going to be hard to get. But then, kind of randomly, I just received a email from Reid Hoffman. I mean, not to me personally, but one of those dear friend blasts and all. I checked. It's like 2,000 plus people, get that. But in the email, he mentioned like I'm founding my first startup since LinkedIn, or I'm co-founding my first startup since LinkedIn, and it's going to be about AI. And earlier in my career, at the start of my career, I went to college as an engineer. I programmed. I took Fortran. I mean, long dormant language, but it's like I was always frustrated. I'd make a small syntax mistake, and of course, my program wouldn't work. And he had this one line in the email. Instead of us learning the machine's language, the machine was going to learn our language. This idea that the new programming language is English, or a human language. And that just kind of gave me this idea, speaking human. I will confess to you, I had not thought about artificial intelligence since I was in college. So that had been a lot of decades. But it just like, this is interesting. So one of the people I was talking to about doing this other book, I said, this is like December, early December in 2022, is right, literally within 4 or 5 days of ChatGPT being released. It wasn't even a big deal yet. There's kind of a bit of a delay. It took like a week or two before the whole world was talking about ChatGPT. So I called this guy I knew, a source, and like, what do you think about it? And he just sort of like, it's the perfect time. And like, I just, I guess a lesson for people listening, I try to follow my instincts. It's just like, and I try to listen to smart people. Reid Hoffman's a smart person. The fellow I was calling, I was reaching out to, a well-known venture capitalist. He really knew what was going on. And so I just kind of jumped on it. It just seemed like this is the time to write about artificial intelligence. So just as things were starting to go crazy, just as the whole world was starting to talk about AI, I had this idea and was working on a proposal to sell to a publisher. Just like, well, you could just decide to write a book, but I have to write a proposal to a publisher. Are you interested? Will you pay me money for it? So I just had really, really good timing because of this random email. On a different day, I made it hit delete. I get 2 or 3 of these blasts from Reid Hoffman a year. And like I confess, I didn't always read them. This one I read, it just kind of really struck me.
Nice. And in the book, you portray the current AI boom as a $1 trillion race. And having, I think you have seen the tech cycles and many times, right, before. And what do you think this AI wave makes different? And it's a, I think we went through so many AI winters, but
Right.
do you think this time is different?
I definitely think this time is different. I mean, like any boom, there'll be a slowdown, there'll be a fallout and stuff. But no, I think AI is here to stay. This is the real deal. I think a couple of things, comparing. So I started, I mean, I kind of worked on a mainframe, I guess, when I was in college. I was, punch cards with a terminal. And then, I'm old enough to kind of bought a computer, a personal computer early on in the PC revolution. And of course, I covered, starting in the mid 90s, the internet revolution. And, we'll throw another one 14 years later. 1994 was the start of the internet. 2008 or so was the arrival of mobile as a big category, as a big platform shift. And, to me, what's so interesting about AI is it builds on all of them. It builds on, kind of the network effect, and the internet, mobile on chips. And so to me, it's the culmination. I've been at this for decades. And so AI really, struck me as a culmination. And there are similarities to the internet era. Like you want to compare 2023 to 1997, 1998, like someone would come up with an idea at a memo and 1 week later, have $100 million valuation, that kind of thing, like instant company and stuff. But I'll tell you, this is moving faster. I mean, some of the stats we've seen that, the adoption rate that ChatGPT got to 1 million users much faster than any tech product ever. It got to 100 million much faster than any product ever, Facebook, Google, whatever example you want to give. And just like, it's moving so fast, like we're trying to say what's going to be in 6 months, but the world is changing. Like, everything was big, 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 and then DeepSeek hits, and, suddenly we're rethinking things. It's just like all of a sudden it's reasoning models, but now there are people casting doubt on that. So to me, just like the speed at which this is happening and the decisions that are being made, even though we don't know where we're going to be a year from now. I mean, we'll have a sense that, AI will be better and stronger and all, but, it's like this to me, it's almost like the PC era probably felt very quick to people, but then the internet came along and that accelerated the speed. And now AI, to me, since 2022, has caused an even greater acceleration. That things are moving that fast.
And to me, like OpenAI is winning in this game, and it's things happening now. But I mean, after the Transformer paper came out in 2017, I think many companies had a chance to win this game, right? AI, like
Including Google, which came up
yeah,
with the Transformer
yes,
paper. That was kind of a quaint time when researchers were sharing their research. I'm sure Google, for the next Transformer paper, if they come up with one, won't be sharing it with the wider world. Yeah, I mean, it was it's interesting. AI, I make the argument in the book, a lot of people make this argument that it really favors the incumbents. It requires so much money and so much data. Apple keeps on stumbling, but I wouldn't count Apple out, right? There are a billion plus users. Facebook is hardly at the leading edge, but they have billions of loyal users and all. But with that said, the advantage to the incumbents, with that said, there's a disadvantage to the incumbents that they're more cautious. They're putting more at risk. So, Google, I write about this in the book, they had Meena, MEENA, I think, and it was ChatGPT before ChatGPT. They had it. It was like 2020, a couple of years before ChatGPT came out, but they were scared of it. PR, the marketing people were fearful, like, oh my goodness, what if it says something inappropriate? There was Microsoft released one called Tay in 2016. And within 24 hours, it was a Nazi saluting white supremacist, anti-Semitic, it was all this spewing all this garbage. And Microsoft had to pull it. And I think all the big companies, Google, Microsoft, Meta, were frightened by that. So it had to be a startup. It had to be an OpenAI that came out with something this bold. Let's just put it out there. Let's just put ChatGPT out there. It's not quite perfect yet. Of course, it will say things that we're not going to like, but we're going to take that risk. And they really haven't lost that lead. There was a time about a year ago, it seemed, where it was really narrowing. Like Anthropic's Claude was catching up, but I 100% agree with you. This is OpenAI's fight to lose, and I do think there's a very good chance they will, given they're up against Google, Microsoft, Meta, Anthropic. I'm impressed with as a company, but it's also different because if we're looking at the large language models, then we could throw Anthropic in the mix. But another thing that's amazing about Google is they're competing with very strong products on large language models, but also text to video, text to image. They are across the board. They have a strong offering of AI. So again, Google got beat. They blew it. Google was so far ahead of everyone in the 2010s. In AI, they had all this talent. It's not a coincidence to me that the Transformer paper, was born inside of Google, but they were just scared of it and all. But they're not scared of it anymore. And so it is an interesting battle. OpenAI is the favorite, but the favorites don't always win.
Yeah, very interesting time we live in. But now Anthropic and OpenAI are doing really well. But do you think they will keep winning in this game? But as you mentioned, like a big tech company, because Google, Facebook, Apple has a bunch of money and resources, and will they catch up eventually or acquire those startup eventually? I want to know that dynamics of like a startup
Yeah.
versus big tech companies in this AI era.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, no one knows the answer to that question, but I do think about the money. So Dario Amodei, the CEO, very well regarded figure in AI, he said that, so when I started in 2023, you needed millions of dollars to train and fine tune one of these large language models. By the time I was done reporting, let's say, the end of 2024, it was it was hundreds of millions of dollars into the billions. And Amode says that by 2027, it could be $100 billion, to train and fine tune one of these things. And of course, that's only some of the cost. You then have to operate. It's very, energy intensive. It's very, it takes a lot of capital just to answer the queries and all that. In fact, one of the startups I talked to for the book, they had to cut back their product. They had to stop spreading the word because it was too expensive. They didn't have enough cash to operate. It's an amazing model, but they had too many users and they were going to go bankrupt and stuff. So, it's a very expensive thing. And like, how does a startup raise $100 billion? I mean, you give away a piece of yourself for that, that first tranche, the C, the A, the B, the C, and eventually, like, there's not that much more to give away. So, playing it out, like, OpenAI is remarkable. They have a $300 billion plus valuation. They've raised, tens of billions of dollars. But what happens when you get to the hundreds of billions? So I'm not ready to count them out, but I do wonder if it's inevitable that an Anthropic or an OpenAI has to merge. They have to be acquired by a giant. But I have no idea. I'm just sort of kind of playing it out in my head, and I do think that it's harder to be a startup if you want to do something foundational. Anthropic and OpenAI, Runway here in New York City, a startup I spent some time with for the book. They do text to video, they do AI video. They have clients in Hollywood. They're very, they have revenue. They're doing very, very well. So there are a few that are doing it, but they're now up against Google and OpenAI, both of which have their very impressive text to video models and other and other companies, and I just don't know how it plays out. It's just all I know is I went looking for the next Google, the next Meta, and I fear, not sure I'm right, but I fear that the next Google is Google, that the next Meta is Meta. And there's plenty of room to make money for a startup. I mean, I'm not saying venture capitalists stop investing, but I'm talking about the next $1 trillion company. I'm talking about the next Google, Meta, Microsoft, Apple. Kind of the giant. So there's plenty of room to do apps and do a million interesting things. But if we're talking about kind of those companies that define the era, I'm not sure in Anthropic or Runway and OpenAI are going to make it. I do wonder if they're going to have to be bought.
I see. I see. And when Google started and became a dominant, I mean, like in 1997 or 2000, I was too young and I don't remember what the time
Yeah.
looked like. But I mean, but the Google, you've seen that how Google grew over time, and then Google became the
Right.
biggest one of the biggest one. But don't you think that OpenAI can go to the same path? But you said like next to Google is Google, but
I
the
said I
Google, yeah.
worry that the next Google. So actually, I
Mhm.
was around then. So I think it was 1998 when Google was founded. I was working for this internet magazine called the Industry Standard, very interesting magazine. It only lasted a few years, but we're all using the Alta Vista search engine. And when people heard about another search engine, why? This one's good. Why do we need another one? But once Google was released, let's say 1999 is, I think, maybe there was 2000 when it really started to gain popularity. It was almost like one day every single computer in the newsroom, had Alta Vista, and 1 week later, virtually every computer in the newsroom had Google. It was a better product and stuff. And so it was heads and tails above others. Can OpenAI make it? Yes, I'm not bidding against that company. I'm not bidding against Sam Altman. Astounding founder, astounding leader. What he's pulled off is remarkable. But I will say, I like ChatGPT, but I don't think it's any better than Claude. I like Claude, but I don't think it's like heads and tails above Gemini or it's Google's or Microsoft's Copilot and all. So for the foreseeable future, they're all a commodity. They're leapfrogging each other and like, oh, now theirs is more powerful. Now theirs is more powerful and stuff. And I don't think one has that product advantage that Google has. And again, that second factor that you know Google raised money from kind of at the time the two best known venture capital outfits in Silicon Valley. Maybe they raised $20 million combined. I can't remember exactly, but something on that order. It might have even been less and all. And like they really didn't have to raise that much money afterwards. The advertising model, rather quickly meant like, oh, we don't have to raise more funds. OpenAI's problem is that they have to raise astonishing sums of money. And again, like Google, the breadth of their offering means that they have to raise money for everything, for their large language model, for their text to video, for their image generated. Again, they have a range of products, which is very expensive to create them, to improve them, to fine tune them, and to operate them. So again, it's I'm not going to count OpenAI out. They're astonishing startup. I just worry about the amount of cash they're gonna have to raise.
I see. Yeah, really interesting and yeah, insightful. And in that sense, so how do like AI startup compete with or like find the opportunity in this market? So if you are startup founder and startup CEO of AI startup, how do you compete or how do you find the opportunity in the market?
Yeah, I mean, you go up the stack, like I'm saying, on the foundational front. I'm not even sure any venture capitalists I'm not sure there are many venture capitalists who are out there looking for, you know, anyone doing a foundational company. I could be wrong. There might be like Google with Alta Vista. There's a completely different way of doing it, and so folks find that promising. But again, go up the stack. Look for AI in the law, AI in medicine, AI in education. There's lots of opportunities building on top. It's far less expensive. I mean, that's even Perplexity, which we haven't mentioned, a very impressive AI answer engine. I mean, they're not doing the foundational stuff. They're operating on top, of other large language models. And, that to me is more the approach I would be taking if I was in that world. Like kind of, what's the expression, like do the wrapper. I mean, then you have the problem like, okay, well, how do you differentiate yourself? What's your mode? But I would argue that there is no mode for anybody. The foundation, does Google, does OpenAI, does, Anthropic, no one really has a moat right now. That's the problem. But, again, I think the opportunity to create, an extraordinary company that goes from, hundreds of millions to billions to tens of billions of dollars, maybe more in revenue, that's a hard battle to fight. But, the idea of creating interesting companies that, make millions and tens of millions and ultimately hundreds of millions, in SaaS and kind of middleware and kind of data labeling. I mean, there's a million opportunities out there. I am just dubious of the number of opportunities to create the next huge, great company.
I see. And in the book, I think you have interviewed so many, I mean, to write a book, I think you have interviewed so many key figures and then checked out so many AI tools and products and so on. But do you have anything you wanted to publish in the book, or but you couldn't, or something hidden story, hidden gem, if you have any?
Yeah, no, actually, it's funny. So when I started the book, so again, it was the end of 2022, and the world wasn't as clear then as it is today. So I had this idea, and I'll confess, I jumped in without having the foundational research. I kind of knew AI had been around. I kind of had heard of the Transformer paper. I had played a little bit with what's it called, OpenAI's image generator, and so, pardon?
Dari?
Yeah,
Dari's-
DALL-E. Yes. But I didn't have much. I didn't have much depth to the knowledge. So I started off saying like, oh, I want to follow 3 startups. So I had Reid Hoffman, co-founded Mustafa Suleiman, a star of AI. He's a co-founder of DeepMind. He went on to work at Google. He was an executive at Google, and a third co-founder who was a very well-regarded figure in AI. And I thought like, okay, they have star power. They raise money from Bill Gates and Will.i.am and Ashton Kutcher. Before they had a product, they had raised hundreds of millions of dollars. They brought out their product. It's called Pi. It's kind of, it differentiated because it was high in EQ, emotional intelligence, and not just IQ intelligence. And 1 month after they released it, they raised another $1.3 billion. So they raised like over $1.5 billion. They're well-known founders. They got all this attention in media. So then I went looking for like an underdog. There's a company, they got into YC, but there were 2 outsiders. It was, kind of someone who was a community college dropout rather than a regular college dropout, and kind of was hooked up with a really genius founder who, like in 2018, came up with AI search long before almost anyone else. And so he was working on AI search in 2018. I thought, oh, that'd be an interesting company. So, one, Inflection, Reid Hoffman's company, going for, kind of the chatbot market, which seemed the most central market. And, the second company, an underdog no one had really heard of, they raised only a few $1 million, taking on Google. right? I mean, there's no bigger company, tech company in Silicon Valley than Google. And then the third company, Runway, I thought they were really interesting. They were also outsiders. There were three artists who got involved in the mid 2010s in doing text to video. And they were earlier than most. In 2018, they founded Runway, and they were getting a lot of momentum and stuff. So I had this idea in my head that I'd follow these three startups as they all try to cash in on this AI moment. But then, I realized like so much of the story is around Google. So much of the story is around Microsoft. So much of the story is about Meta, and it kind of crowded out those other two smaller startups. So they're in there. But I wrote several chapters about Andy, A-N-D-I. That's the AI search company that was accepted into YC. But I ended up publishing a few paragraphs about them instead of a few chapters about them. Runway, there's only a couple of lines in the book about Runway. I ended up doing a spin out and doing an article for The Information about Runway. But whenever you write a book, I kind of write long. I have that story in my head, and I put it on, I commit it to paper, to the screen and stuff, but I always write long. Every book that was my 11th book, I'll cut it by 20 or 25%. This book, I try to avoid that as much as possible. Like, so I ended up not writing the Runway chapters because like, it took me like 6 months to realize like, oh, okay, I have to devote a lot more attention to Google and Microsoft than I originally thought. There's so much interesting history that at the beginning of the book I kind of do a quick run through the history. How did we get here? Like in the 1950s, someone coined the term artificial intelligence, and they were such optimists. For 70 years, AI has been just around the next corner. It's always been a decade away. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, there have been AI winters, like, oh, we think, oh, no, we don't. Like, and, back then, almost all of the resources, almost all the attention was on the rules-based approach, not the machine learning approach. But we're going to, through sheer muscle, line by line, anticipate every single scenario, and that's what artificial intelligence is going to be. It obviously didn't work, or perhaps we'll have to go back to that and merge the two. But that was kind of this 50-year wrong turn, and so I ended up cutting out, either not writing or just tossing aside and not publishing a lot of material in the book, that reporting I'd done for the book.
Really interesting. And since you tapped on like the process of editing and writing and editing, I was always curious, how's the writing process look like? I mean, did you have editor first of all, do you structure or think of, oh, this is chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, or is it more like you interview someone, then write a chapter, and how does it work? I mean, editing,
Right.
writing.
So I mean, every writer has his or her methods and styles. So I have mine, but it's in it. How do you program? How do I mean, there's different approaches to writing, but I always work with an editor. I really can't afford to like, oh, I'm going to spend the next year and a half, 2 years of my life writing about AI without somebody kind of helping me pay for that. Get an advance from a publisher. So HarperCollins, a big publisher, gave me an advance, which allowed me to spend a year plus researching, and then 6 months writing. I spent a couple months rewriting. But with my editor, we have a good working relationship. This is our third book together, and so from the start, I would say like, here's my potential characters. What do you think of Andy, the search company I mentioned before, the underdog and stuff. And like, so we're kind of like, not constantly, every few months, I'm doing reporting. Oh, I just spent a week out in Silicon Valley. Here's how I'm thinking about things. She really pushed me to include some of my own story in it. I've been covering this since the mid 1990s and really wanted me to like, okay, you've been writing about this for 25 plus years. How is 30 years? How is this different? How is this the same? So she's kind of helping me shape it, but who's kidding who? It's a very lonely process, right? I mean, like I go out and I do my interviews, but then I come back and then I use AI to transcribe the interviews, but even then you just have a mass of words. Then I have to go through the transcripts, And it's interesting that that second listen, like obviously I sat through the first interview, but you're thinking of different things. What's my next question? That when you could listen back to the tape, especially with the transcript, you were like, oh wow, that was a good insight. I didn't quite catch that. So you're constantly reshaping it. So I don't do a formal outline. There are many writers who do. I do not. But I have a very clear idea. I have all these index cards on my wall, and kind of chapter one history. Oh, I want to have these characters. Marvin Minsky. I kind of like, what characters do I have there? What do I want to say in that chapter? Chapter two. Let's introduce Reid Hoffman as a character. That was one of those chapters where Reid has a very interesting life. I mean, not only is he co-founder of LinkedIn, but the first money with two others in Facebook. So the $37,500 he invested in Facebook when it went public was worth 400 million. He leaves LinkedIn, finds a CEO to take over, becomes a venture capitalist. His first ever investment as a venture capitalist, Airbnb, which was more than 1,000x for Greylock, his firm, and the biggest hit in the firm's in the firm's history. So he just has a really, and plus he's just an interesting character. Like a lot of founders, and I understand this, they're kind of monomaniacal. They're focused on their company and maybe the realm they're in, AI, whatever realm they're in. But Hoffman's always been. I mean, some of he's just a constantly workaholic, doesn't really take breaks, but he just thinks about the world. He's kind of like Silicon Valley's philosopher. He's kind of one of the best connected people in Silicon Valley. Everyone knows him. He's a liberal fellow, but even the conservatives, despite the nastiness, or whatever you want to call it, of like kind of the Trump versus non-Trump folks, everyone seems to like Reid, and he seems to know everyone and get along with more or less everyone. So that chapter started off probably as 10,000 words, and in the book it's probably like 4,000 or 5,000 words. So a lot of it is distillation. I write it like, okay, do I need that? Do I need that? I shrink it down. But so I have a general idea of chapter by chapter, at least through the first half. And then, and then the second half is like, okay, that's going to be my reporting. So a lot of what I did is I followed Inflection, Reid Hoffman, Mustafa Suleyman's company, is like, they're trying to teach EQ to the model. How do you do that? I spent time like, okay, now we're giving it voice. Now we're connecting it to the intranet. Like, okay, it's too agreeable. It's just too, oh, that was a really good question. Like, how do you tone that down? It's kind of whack-a-mole of, you want it to have a little bit more personality, a little bit more edge. Like, oh, okay, now it has too much edge. So, that was going to go through my reporting. The reporting was going to dictate kind of the second half of the book. And so, again, there are a lot of writers that they plot it all out. I just kind of have, almost look at it like a map. Like, how do I get from New York to San Francisco? Well, okay, I'll cross this bridge and I'll hit New Jersey and then I'll go through Pennsylvania. You know what I mean? I have a general idea, but what does Pennsylvania look like? I don't know. It's just like, once I really delve into the material, then I'll have a good sense of who's the main character, what's the main point, all of that kind of stuff. And then, I hand in a draft, and this is where my editor, Hollis Heimbach of HarperCollins, this is where she's invaluable. She doesn't really edit it, line edit at that point, but she gives me feedback. I really like this, but too much about this person. I want to hear more about that. Like I kind of describe Silicon Valley as a place, and you guys know it well. It's like, it's not really a place, right? I mean, it's just like, it's highways and, and so, but I wanted to like, the way I write is through characters and scenes and plays. And like, oh, I had that in chapter 16 or 18 or something like that. Like, we need that much earlier. You need to show us the characters and make them real. And so a lot of it was just her giving me notes, giving me feedback and stuff. And then, I take a month and I rewrite it. And then it's more, she edits it. The publisher has a copy editor, just making sure all the grammar and all that stuff is right, proofread or legal review and all. So, it's a collaborative process, except for the writers doing like 90% of the work until the very end.
But did you use AI in the process? I mean, you said you use
Yeah.
AI to transcribe the interviews, but did you use AI for writing for editing?
So the first thing I did, when I had this idea, like I got Reid Hoffman's email, is I went to ChatGPT and said, write me a 5,000 word book proposal on AI. And, I did more than that. I gave it like, I want to tell, Reid Hoffman will be a large character. I want to make these points and yada, yada, yada. And, it spit out. I mean, it was kind of the first time I used it as a tool. Again, like I said, I played with DALL-E, but it was like, it was magic. It was a sorcery. Like, I hit enter and like within a few seconds, it's starting to spit out the answer. So like, they really opened my eyes like, wow, this is something. I got to pay attention to this. But, two things. One, it's far better read than I am, has a far better memory than I do. And it was interesting. It had all these insights, all these little factoids or insights, like, oh, that's good. I should use that. I should use that. But the second thing is, it can't write for crap. It's, GPT 3.5, I guess at that point, I don't have to worry about my job. I don't have to worry, GPT 4.5 or whatever they're on. I don't have to worry about it replacing me. GP 10, I don't know. We could talk about that in 10 years. I'll come back on. But it's like, it really couldn't write for anything. But it was very useful to me. It taught me. And, what really impressed me is watching what other people did with it. Generative AI, it's not a regurgitation machine, it's original. Like, explain Karl Marx's economic theory in the form of a Taylor Swift song. And, it's like, okay, that's original. It's not like that's sitting out there. It found it. And it was really good. It was really good at it. And so I really kind of started off, during the dot-com era, I was kind of more the skeptic. You can't get rich overnight. The internet's interesting, but it's not instant companies, that kind of thing. But here I wasn't a skeptic. And I used AI every day, sometimes, especially when I was writing, 20 times a day. Like, I'm struggling, I give it a paragraph. I'm struggling with this paragraph. I just feel like I'm not getting to the main point, or it's too wordy, cut it, or I give it a section, like I need a transition here. And, it was never like, I'm going to cut and paste and like, oh, that's perfect. Like, I go through that process, or give me 5 different ways of saying this same sentence that I was struggling with. And it'd be interesting because like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. Flip the sentences, change this, like that's the right word. So it kind of like, it was almost like breaking writer's block, like I'm struggling, I'm not making progress. I give it to the machine and it's giving me some good ideas back. Again, it really can't write the kind of way I write. It's too formulaic, it's too flat. But it was a very useful tool. And then I should have said this first, a great research assistant. I'm writing about I'm about to meet with this venture capitalist, tell me, give me their background, what's the specialty of this venture firm, that kind of thing. And like, so I'd always use Perplexity though, because they would footnote. And, as a journalist, like, early on, I did one of those for a venture capitalist, and it said she worked at blah, blah, blah firm. Well, she didn't. And, I kind of like, okay, watch out for hallucinations because I don't want to put that into my book. So I, made sure that whenever I use it as a research assistant, like I could click, okay, that quote is from a CNBC article on the CNBC site. I can trust that it didn't make up that quote. While I was doing my research early on, like, 2 lawyers in New York, they feared they'd be disbarred. They only got fined. They handed in a pleading to a court, and all 5 of the cases cited in the pleading were made up. And that really kind of like, okay, watch out. Don't be those lawyers that's on page 1 because you like trusted this thing. But, I've had interns I've paid in the past and they make mistakes. I have to check out their works. This is just an amazing research assistant. And then kind of iterate ideas. Like, hey, here's this interview I did, help me out. What's significant here? What's novel here and stuff, and then so I would use it for that, and then I kind of got in the habit of like, read this chapter, correct any mistakes in bold, make any suggestions you want and stuff, and like, oh, right, I missed this misspelling. Sometimes it was simple as that. Other times it had a suggestion for rewriting. Again, it wasn't like I would take that suggestion. It showed me like, oh, there's something wrong with this. So then I had to put it through my human brain, but it would call it out. And then, so Google Notebook, which is a really interesting product, was just starting to become popular by the time I was finished. And so I got in the habit of like, hey, I've written this thing, here are the two interviews it's based on. Did I miss anything important? And so that was really interesting, too. I do wonder for my next book, I'm going to routinely take every single interview I do, put it into a Google Notebook or whatever, product is the one I use, and, kind of help me highlight, like, okay, these are the top line things. Here's the original things. They're saying it's to me an amazing tool. Now I know some writers who would be horrified what I'm talking about. Like, I'm sort of tainting my work by letting the machine in, but like I work with editors, I work with research assistants and stuff. And to me, I used it as a co-pilot. I used it as a really, as a tireless, well-read, amazing at summarizing stuff. I would use it that way too. Like, okay, here's a 47-page paper written in much more technical language than I can understand. Help me understand this, summarize this, for someone who doesn't have a deep technical background. So I don't know, I find AI an enormous tool. And in fact, this idea that AI is going to replace humans, that's going to happen. But I think in the short run, and maybe the medium term, humans who use AI are going to best humans who don't use AI because I'm more productive. It amplifies my intelligence. It amplifies my ability to write. Again, if you use it right. Like if I just used it to write something and hand it in, I think my career would be over. I mean, it would be flat and not very good. And I think you'd get caught doing that because, it is something of a plagiarizing engine. At least that's what the lawsuit the New York Times filed against OpenAI. So I'm scared of that too. If it gives me a few lines, like how original is that? So again, I use it as almost source material, and then I put it through the human brain, my brain, to rework it and kind of put it in my words.
Right. Interesting. And I recently realized the danger in AI using AI is like, as you mentioned, like, if Perplexity or AI tools show the citation and people tend to trust. But the funny story is recently, we are a startup based in San Francisco, and recently my friend, good friend of mine, reached out to me. She's an investor, and I searched about Glasp, and did you guys raise 8.5 million or something? And because Perplexity shows, Glasp raised 8.5 million, and from these like a top tier investors of VCs, but we've never, and so
Right. Sorry.
but yeah, so yeah, I know that. Yeah,
Maybe he's anticipating the future.
maybe.
Well,
But
actually, I had the same
yeah,
experience. Like, I was it Claude? No, it was another one. I went to it like, tell me about Gary Rivlin, and it told me that I won an Emmy. It was like, and then I asked, what did Gary Rivlin win an Emmy? And of course, it couldn't tell me because no, I have not won an Emmy, and stuff. And so again, that was kind of a early good lesson. Like, okay, these things are sorcery, but double check. Make I experienced in a very personal way the hallucination problem, and that was an important lesson to me that don't overly trust these things.
yeah. And regarding AI safety, I remember like when Google acquired DeepMind, I think there is a condition like a clause that like having an AI safety board and also don't go for like a military
Right,
surveillance and so on. But
right.
eventually Google decided to go with that. And what's your thoughts on like AI safety and
Yeah.
these things?
When I started off in 2023, and I was really impressed by this. Like AI safety was front and center. Everyone had their trust and safety. All the big companies, at least, and some of the startups had their trust and safety teams. There's been 3 now, international meetings around AI. The first 2 were about AI safety, but the third one in Paris in January 2025, AI safety took a distant second, a back seat to winning this competition. I really do fear that with the stakes, with again, as I described before, like oh, Google's model is now the most powerful. Oh nope, Anthropic. That I do fear that AI safety is taking a back seat, and my worry beyond just being a human being and worrying like these things are powerful, I tend to be optimistic. I think they'll do extraordinary things in education and medicine and science across the board and all, but any new technology is pro and con. Good things come, television's amazing. Television means people staring in a box for 6 or 8 hours. The car is amazing, but 35,000, 40,000 Americans die every year in car accidents and pollution. So all technologies cut both ways. I'm convinced if we're deliberate about it, we're smart about it, AI will be a net positive. But if we just toss aside AI safety, responsible AI, I fear that it'll be a net negative. And another thing too is I just think it's a bad strategy by Silicon Valley that, you look at polling and the majority of people, at least in our country, in the US, are mistrustful. They're fearful of AI. I mean, a minority are excited about AI and, there's AI had really bad timing. It came, it hit in a big time kind of way at the end of 2022 and 2023 when mistrust in big tech was at its height. Google, Meta, Amazon, there's a lot of mistrust versus all those companies. And I fear that those who are saying full speed ahead, Mark Andreessen's famous for saying like, the trust and safety teams are an enemy of AI because AI could do so many amazing things. If you slow it down, you might be responsible for deaths because all the lives AI could save. And I understand the argument he's making, but I want to say back, like, however, if you get too far ahead, because I guarantee you something bad is going to happen with AI. I don't know what it is going to be. Like, $1 trillion is siphoned off from the global economic system before a human even sees what's happening. I don't know what it is, but something's going to happen. And I think people are going to be really turned off on AI. I wish Silicon Valley was holding the public's hand a little bit more and just reassuring us like, don't worry, we're testing this. And, a lot of that, red team testing, like, we have a new powerful model. We're not just releasing it. I mean, OpenAI, Anthropic, they all, test this stuff. I just wish they were talking about that more. And I wish that they were taking it more seriously. Google's a perfect example. You brought it up. They're like, oh, we pinky swear we're never going to use this for military reasons or for, kind of surveillance and stuff. And it started 2025. They changed that. They're in a race for their life. Their core search is being threatened by AI. And, you just read reports all the time from inside Google that folks who had been working on trust and safety were brought over to, a different part of the company to get this stuff out there faster. Again, I just worry it's a bad strategy.
Yes. And it seems like the power goes into the human hands, and also I think there are so many threats that AI could impact on our daily life and work and so on and humanity. But what threat we should care the most? I mean, there's so many aspects, right? As you mentioned, like privacy and I don't know, like the fake news and so on, and powers to hands and.
You mean it's a big energy thing? Like, within 5 years, we're gonna have to double the amount of data centers we have just to power this stuff. And it's a huge burden on the electric grid and kind of the climate change angle. Yeah, there is a long list of worries. I mean, a lot of these can be managed, but on the top of my list, you mentioned the one that is on top of my list, and that's the concentration of too much power in too few hands. Like this is so powerful, it's so transformative that it can't be in the hands of a few people in Silicon Valley. I admire Sam Altman. I think he's an extraordinary human being. I don't really trust Sam Altman. Sam Altman is hyper competitive and wants to win more than anything else. We're talking about, AI, like every language, every culture, everything. Like it needs to be a global effort, and that's a big fear of mine. That I fear that the same few big tech companies are going to dominate this. That again, there'll be lots of other smaller companies, but the large language model that is foundational to a lot of what's going to happen. So that's one big fear. I also am scared of something that probably excites a lot of people in Silicon Valley, and that's autonomous AI. I want a human in the loop. In 20 years, I don't know, but for the foreseeable future, we need a human in the loop. These things don't understand a thing. They're a parrot. They're just repeating words. They don't have common sense. We call them reasoning models. They emulate human reasoning. They don't have reasoning. And so that worries me, especially the more important the task. You want to have autonomous AI that just, you talk with as a chatbot. Okay, that's one thing, but AI in charge of any essential system, AI in charge of something there's so many things that humans need to be in the loop. So I get really worried about autonomous, or what's the term for where it's it's self-learns.
Agent.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's agents, which I think agents will be great in 5 or 10 years. I think if 2025 is the year of the agent, it's a lot of hype. I joke that I think AI is both overhyped and underhyped. And it's this idea, and I've seen this since the mid 1990s, we tend to overstate the short-term impact of a new technology and understate the long-term impact of a new technology. We saw that with the internet, we see that with a lot of things, and I think that's AI. And so the underhyped argument is like, in 10 years, in 15 years, this is going to be, AI is going to be at the center of everything, just like the internet is at the center of everything, just like the phone is at the center of everything. But the overhype is companies today saying this is the year of the AI agent. It's companies today saying that AGI is just around, it's coming next year. Like, okay, I get it. You've raised $1 billion in venture capital. Your venture capitalists want to hear you say that and stuff. But I do think we're a breakthrough or two away from artificial general intelligence. So that's another way. So to me, it's like individual companies, individual founders, individual investors are overhyping this. Kind of optimistically crossing their fingers. I hope this comes, sooner rather than later, because I have to start showing revenue. But I think kind of the broader point about AI, in a way, I think it's being underhyped, just in the sense that I just think it's going to be transformational. I think it's just going to be at the center of everything. Just again, in 1995, 1998, like, the internet was Craigslist. The internet was, static. It wasn't really that impressive. In 2000, when, PayPal started to become popular, the problem? 90% of the people were buying something online and then mailing a paper check. Except this takes a long time. Companies are cautious. People, you have to fight for them to change their habits. And so, over time, though, people are going to see the benefit. Like, oh, wow, okay, I could, plan a trip, in an hour working with a personal agent rather than spending a day or two. People are figuring out in the work world, like, oh, wait, I have a basic report to write. Like, why don't I just have the AI do the draft and then I'll go work with it, and I could do it a day what it would take me 2 weeks to do. So, I think there are actual use cases where this thing is useful today. But, I do think people tend to embrace technology. Businesses, organizations, society tend to embrace technology much slower than we in our heads imagine that they will.
Totally. And how do how do human society address those risks and threats? Like, power issue, also AGI. So how do human society address it?
I think we need to be thoughtful about it. I think we have to be deliberate. I wish we were talking about it more. I wish there was kind of a international body that seriously was taking this on. I mean, it's hard because like if you say like let's test these models more, let's require them to, share information with the government, people are going to say like you're slowing them down, but China, we're in a race with China. And it's just like it's hard, but I really do think that we need to be deliberate. Like, things can break humanity's way if we're deliberate about it, if we're talking about it. And, that's a big fear I have about the Trump administration in Washington, where, Biden's administration, they were taking baby steps. They were doing modest proposals just so there was more of a discussion, more sharing of information. One of the things they were requiring is if you have a new powerful model, a model more powerful than the ones that exist right now, you need to red team them. You need to, kind of let the government know this is going on, just so we know what's going on here. And, within 2 days of Trump in office, they got rid of that. It was an executive order. They could just undo it. And, that Paris meeting in the start of 2025, JD Vance said, like, let's stop with the hand wringing and let's just win this race. And, I get it. I mean, there's exciting things to come. This is a race, and, which it will be Silicon Valley, it will be, in China, that's kind of leading the way here. I get the stakes here, but I think we could do both. I think we could do cutting edge stuff. I think we could do amazing stuff. And I just wish we would talk about it, have some basic rules in place, some basic boundaries in place, and say, as long as you're doing this, you're fine. And, but that's not the approach right now. And I fear that in this country, at least, that's not going to be the approach during the 4 years that Trump is president.
I see. And I'm curious about the future of journalism, because you were a journalist for decades. And do you see impact? I think, AI could impact a lot in journalism. But first of all, what is journalism to you? I mean, in your words, and also, how do you see the impact of AI on these things?
Yeah, so I mean, one basic thing that journalists do is they go out and they talk to people. And so can an AI model create a basic news story? Yes, very well. There's something formulaic about a news article. However, who's doing the interviewing? I suppose you could have AI listening, watching a city council meeting and coming up with, quotes, but like, I don't think it would be the way the technology is now. I don't think it's going to do a very good job of that. But again, what I do, I did like I did interviews with like 150 human beings here who is doing that. And that's core to journalism. What's journalism? It's just like, you're going out and you're explaining a little piece of the world, whether it's around politics or technology, whatever it is. I'm more of a feature writer, so I'm bringing you to a world. I'm, creating something that brings you in that world, so you understand what's the issues, what's the stakes, those kind of things. Yeah, I guess I am worried for, concrete reasons. Like, we've seen different news outlets, CNET, Sports Illustrated, have relied on AI and got in trouble for it. At least they got grief for it. CNET, backed off a lot of what they were doing. But we're seeing copy editors cut because, like I was saying, like, AI is a pretty good copy editor. Meaning like it's been written, a human editor has gone over it, but the copy editor just making sure everything's just so. Like just like your verbs agree, if you know what I'm talking about, and just all of that kind of stuff. It's very precise. And like, so I do fear, this is kind of a general fear for journalism and many other professions, shrinkage. If you had to have 200 people on the editorial side for a newspaper, well, okay, we could cut corners and have more of the copy edits done by AI. it's obviously much cheaper. I will say though that AI for an investigative journalist is a great tool. It could go through reams, vast amount of data, finding trends, finding the things you ask it to find in a way that it would take a human, like for some of it would be impossible for a human. But it's just like you can use it as a tool. Again, my construct for AI is as a co-pilot. It's as a tool. The human, I make them, go to Runway, make me a movie like Martin Scorsese will make. Like, no, it can't do that. You have to come up with the storyline. You have to come with the characters. You have to go with the dramatic moments. There's a lot of iteration. It's just like, okay, that's close, but it needs to be this, and that. Like, the human is still the creator, the driver, and all. But with that said, it's a really powerful tool. So instead of journalism, let's use marketing. Like some big company has a marketing department of 40 people. Well, I'm imagining in 2 or 3 years, that's going to be a marketing department of 20 people because, well, the basic research the AI could do. The basic report writing the AI could do. Instead of having 3 or 4 illustrators, like, why don't we just have one illustrator and using AI and like, it could produce 100 different versions and you could choose and fine tune and stuff. So to me, journalism and just like many other professions, we're going to have a shrinkage where in the past X could do it. Now half that number are going to be able to do something.
I see. At the same time, I mean, Google, Facebook, their business model is relied on like advertisement, and meaning the more the user engage in the content, the more they make, the more money they can make, right? So
it's part of the problem, yes.
Yeah. So how should we balance these like business model and journalism? But we should, deliver the true story, not the fake news and the important news to people. And yeah.
Well, that's part of the reason you need humans in to kind of help discern between fake news. And by fake news, that term has become so loaded. You're talking about deep fakes. You're talking about fabricated, true fake news. Not like I don't like your coverage, there. But I kind of lost sight of the question. I'm sorry. Ask the question again.
Oh, so the question was like how like it's the mindset of journalism and what journalism is, and also like the what kind of advertisement based like business model like
Advertise,
that
right.
Google, Facebook
So,
are kind of against each other, and how should we balance in the future,
no,
in the era of AI?
No, it's interesting. I don't know. I've spent time on this, but like, so Google when it first came was a godsend for journalism sites, right? Like, it would send people, to the news sites and stuff, and the news site would get a cut of the advertising. Over time, Google and also Meta took they do the same thing, took a greater share of that money, but at least there was some cut of advertising revenue. At least they were sending some, right? If you have your 10 blue links, like, oh, let me click on the New York Times story. Now I'm in the New York Times site reading about it, reading an ad. And so, there was an upside from the New York Times. The real problem with AI is like, it's amazing. I don't have to go to the New York Times site anymore. The AI is going to sum it up. It's not delivering me blue links. It's delivering me the answer. It's kind of what many people love about it, that, it's like, it gives you your individually crafted Wikipedia answer. Whatever your question is, like, I don't have to painstakingly go through all these links. It just gives me the answer, again, with footnotes, because I'm a journalist and stuff. And so, AI is a great threat to journalism. How will a Gemini, how will a ChatGPT make money? Like, okay, there's a subscription service, and a small portion of people are paying for the subscription service. I pay for a couple, but the truth is, I don't pay for ChatGPT, and it's still terrific. The almost as good one is still terrific, and so I don't know, how these things are gonna monetize. I mean, there's a lot of different AI companies out there, like they're doing interesting stuff, and unless they're able to like, okay, I'm doing this thing for law firms, okay, law firms will pay us a lot of money for this, so that's how they're going to do that. But a lot of it, I think, just like in the internet age, the business model was the big question. This is astonishing. We have users, but how are we ever going to actually make profits? How are we actually going to make more revenue than this thing costs? I mean, OpenAI ain't there yet. Anthropic isn't there yet. Gemini is Google's a profitable company, but I'm sure they're not making money on any of their AI. They're not making profits on any of their AI. So that's that's to me just an open question. That's what makes me fear for any startup that's competing with a Microsoft or Google. I mean, Google has $100 billion in cash laying around. They generate tens of billions of dollars in profits. Like they can fund themselves in a way a startup can't. And so in fact, in my book, Inflection, the Reid Hoffman, Mustafa Suleiman company, they end up, Suleiman and most of his folks at Inflection went to Microsoft for a payout and stuff because Suleiman believes that none of these AI companies, he said, like, I just saw into the future that Anthropic, maybe OpenAI, I didn't ask him specifically, and that's kind of a fraud one with him given Microsoft OpenAI. I'm not sure he would have answered, but like, it was his feeling like none of these freestanding models, none of these, models at an Anthropic or an OpenAI are going to survive because it's a commodity for the foreseeable future. No one's making money on this, and they're figuring out interesting ways, APIs, whatever, kind of thing. And so, it was his judgment, like, no matter how great a product we have, we're still years away from actually making profits, i.e. we're going to have to raise, 5 or 10 billions next year, maybe 20, 50, $100 billion, a year or two afterwards. So he thought, like, that's just not worth it. I'll just use Microsoft's money to create my product. I'll just use Microsoft's data and take advantage of Microsoft's reach. They're on 1 billion plus machines and stuff. So it's kind of an open question. Will these things start making ample money where they could be a freestanding business, or will Anthropic, OpenAI have to retreat, be bought by a larger company?
I see. And that reminded me of a kind of double-edged sword of AI, of use of AI, because I've seen this story somewhere on the internet that, like since AI is helping a lot in productivity, so and legal firm usually charge money for the hour they work. But if AI helps them work so faster and they can't make money, so how should we balance the use of AI or something like
Well,
that?
and
And
then
that
look at
would, yeah.
Meta or Mistral. I mean, like, there's a funny expression in Silicon Valley, like, my company's business model is destroying your company's business model, and that's Meta, right? I mean, like, we'll just offer this stuff for free and just create an environment where we'll make money in other ways and stuff. And so, arguably, this stuff will be free. I mean, I don't think anyone in 2022 thought like, oh, wait, open source are going to make these models, LLMs, whatever, text to video, that are almost as good. They're almost as powerful. In some ways, they're better because they're smaller, whatever. But like, the idea that, you'd have open source as a competitor so early on, I think, I mean, Mustafa Suleiman, he brought that up. Others bring that up. So, it's like you might even be competing with free. And by the way, if I was a large corporation, maybe I'd rather do open source. I want to tailor it for me. It's not this closed thing. I can look at the source code and I can make it work for me. I have the talent. I have the people here. So, I mean, AI is at such an interesting period right now. I'll kind of go back to where I started. It's just like this stuff is moving so fast and there's all these curveballs being thrown in. Like, who knows where we'll be a year from now?
It's totally, yes. So you've written an amazing book, AI Valley now. So, and what's next for you? And are you thinking about writing another AI related book, or what are you into now?
Yeah, no, I'm always thinking about writing my next book. I've been a daily newspaper writer, I've been a magazine writer, I've written for trade publications. Books is my favorite thing to do. You know, I'm not happy unless I have another book idea of my head. You know, I have a couple of ideas. I'm fascinated by AI. I'd love to write another AI book. I mean, I just spent the last 2.5 years getting smarter about it, so take advantage of that. I'm thinking of doing something kind of AI adjacent. You know, we brought it up during this conversation, like kind of around energy and AI, like, you know, kind of nuclear, whatever it is, or kind of like there is this idea in Silicon Valley, especially, you know, where there's a lot of optimism, like, you know, AI is going to help us get to abundant energy, energy that's near free. And, you know, the set of issues we've, you know, spoken about a couple times during this conversation will no longer be an issue. So I'm very interested, kind of AI meets climate change, AI, you know, meets kind of energy and stuff. But, you know, I don't know. I've got a few ideas. You got any good ideas for me? What should my next book be about?
Yeah, interesting. So one quick question, because you've written so many interesting books, like the last one was Saving Mainstream, and also like Katrina. How do you pick the the the
Yeah, yeah,
idea
yeah,
eventually? Yeah.
I mean that's changed over the years. Like, so, you know, initially I always had a beat, you know, in journalism. That's my topic area. So, you know, for half dozen years or so, 5 years, I wrote about Chicago politics. And my first book grew out of that. Like, you know, like, oh, there's an interesting book to be written about this moment in Chicago history for this set of reasons. It's interesting to the wider country. In fact, that's where Barack Obama got his political start in Chicago during this period. And so, you know, and the same thing happened then. I was in California, in Oakland, my second book around youth violence. I was writing about that for 2 or 3 years. And I saw like, oh, wait, this is an important story. You know, kids killing kids. It was kind of too soon on that. It wasn't, you know, at that point, it wasn't a very big issue. And all. And so, like, you know, Katrina, I was working for the New York Times. They sent me to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and, you know, kind of, hey, I should have this book. It came out at the 10-year point. Like, you know, all these folks, 80% of the city was covered in water. Like, you know, that means roughly 80% of the people, you know, their home was destroyed. You know, should they rebuild? Could they rebuild? Would anyone help them rebuild? So I kind of followed these families that I had met as a reporter for the New York Times, and followed their journey. But, you know, now I'm independent. In the last 10 years, I've been independent. So I'm not, in quotes, working a beat and stuff. So, you know, I gave the, you know, with Saving Main Street, you know, my dad was a small businessman his whole working life and stuff. So, like, it was like, wow, how are small businesses going to survive that? So that just kind of an idea that came to me early on in COVID. You know, AI, I just, you know, it's sort of random. It was sort of serendipity. I just happened to receive an email at the right moment. So, you know, there's part of me that, you know, longs for covering a beat, because then it more naturally grows. Now I'm just sort of almost waiting for inspiration, you know, kind of thing. So,
Yes. Thank you. So so I think our audience are like writers and aspiring writers, founders, and so on. And do you have any advice to these people?
you know, I love the idea of 10,000 hours. There's this idea that to get good at anything, like writing, you have to put in the time. So someone came up with this idea of like 10,000 hours. That's basically 5 years. You know, 40 hours a week, 50 times 50 weeks, that's 2,000. 5 years, you put in your 10,000 hours. And like, I was not very good at when I first started. And, you know, it's just like practice. And, you know, I had a couple of mentors that, you know, helped me along the way. But, you know, it's like, people always say follow your passion. Like, okay, it's important to be passionate about something, like, but, you know, maybe I'm passionate about rap music. Like, okay, I'm not sure there's a career there, you know, for me. But like, find what you're good at, what you like to do, and then just practice, practice, practice. And like, I turned myself into a journalist. I welcome somebody to read my early articles, and like, you wouldn't think, oh, this guy's going to write 11 books and win a Pulitzer Prize. You know, it's just like, you know, so just stick with it. And the other thing is that, you know, I write for a living, but I joke I rewrite for a living. You know, whereas by that I mean, like, get the rough draft on instead of having like 10,000 pages of interview notes and articles and stuff, like that's overwhelming. But I wrote this 400, 500 page draft. Now I just have to make that 400 page draft better. I call it shrinking the world and stuff. So I read probably every word in that book. I've gone through 3, 4, 5 times. I rewrite it as I cut it. Can I say in 75 words what I took 100 words to say? Kind of almost the Zen editing, like, saying in fewer words. I think that's a good thing and stuff. So, I rewrite a lot. It's just like, again, if you read my drafts, you go like, oh, this guy can't write very well. But the good thing is you don't read my drafts. I get to go through it 3 or 4 times. I have an editor who weighs in and, what's working, what's not working, gives me advice. And all. So, just even if what you put down on paper, like, this is no good, like, yeah, well, you shouldn't judge yourself that way. Work it, rework it. And then if you think this is no good, then we should talk.
But how do you decide, oh, this is, I'm done. Okay, this is done. Because you can edit infinitely, right? Endlessly.
Yes.
How would you decide, oh, this is okay? Is that 95% your gut feeling says, okay, yes, or 85%? And
I'm so sick of it after reading it 4 or 5 times. I'm pretty confident once I've gone through it several times, once I've gotten feedback from my editor. There's a long deceased writer who jokingly said, I was disappointed to learn I can no longer make corrections once the book is in the bookstore. So there is this idea, like, in fact, it's funny, I once, right before I'm about to go on the, publicity circuit, do a book tour, I'll reread the book. And I read it with a pencil and I make changes. I mean, towards what end, I guess, for the paperback and stuff. You're right. You're never done. But like in this case, I got it that AI is a hot topic. I was, among the first books out about this new AI wave. And so I had a big incentive to like, okay, this is ready. I'm very happy with it. I think it's my best book. I'm not saying I shortchanged it and I kind of put this slop out there. But on the other hand, I was keenly aware that, this is a competitive space. There was a hunger right now for AI. Get this out as soon as I can.
Yeah, I was always wondering, why can't we change the book? I mean, I think we can do for Kindle ebooks or ebooks.
Yeah.
And
Well, articles do that. I mean, like you can make corrections online and stuff. But, it's funny. I actually wrote one of the first ebooks ever for Random House in 2001. And one of the things I thought, there were 2 things I thought were amazing about an ebook. One, you could write a 30,000 word book. If it was a book form, it'd be like 120 pages. Like, no one's going to buy a 120 page book. They feel ripped off. So, there's an idea a book has to be, there's an article and then there's a book and there's a lot in between. A 10,000 word article is a really long article. A 60,000 word book is on the shorter side of book. So I kind of like the idea, like an ebook, like we'll write the right amount of words. This is a 37,000 word topic, right? 37,000 words. But the other thing I liked is exactly what you said. Oh, I had it. I already know there's a few mistakes. Small mistakes doesn't change the meaning of anything, but it irritates me. I wish I could change it. An ebook you can. This book I have to wait for it to go into a second printing or the paperback to come out, to make changes. But so I'm with you. I always kind of thought that was an enticing idea, that you could kind of update the ebook.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. So okay, this is the last question, and since Glasp is a startup, where people share what they're reading and learning as the digital legacy, and we want to ask this question: and what impact or legacy do you want to leave behind for future generations?
Okay, if I'm leaving out the fact that I have 2 sons, and I think that's kind of the most important thing I'm doing in life is raising 2 sons. As far as my work, yeah, so I always want to have an impact. I by the time I was writing this book, I had strong feelings about AI, some of which I've shared during this conversation, and I'd like to think that I'm having an impact. I'm, putting a spotlight on some injustice. I'm kind of dramatizing a set of issues so you could think more thoughtfully about them. But as far as my legacy, like I'd like to think that I, for future generations, help define what they think of Hurricane Katrina and what happened. I'd like to think that for people interested in Chicago politics, that long after I'm gone, my book, my work, the articles I wrote are still here, and I can help you understand this moment, this interesting moment in this city's history. COVID, like, God, what was it like for small business back then? In fact, there's an AI angle onto this. It's like, so a lot of writers are very angry, needless to say, that their intellectual property, their work, was used to train these models without permission. The permission part doesn't bother me, without compensation. I would like a little bit of money for the work I did. But the truth is, like, if I found out that, someone is getting an answer about Chicago politics or New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina without having been trained on my book, I'd be disappointed. In fact, I was very pleased. So the Atlantic Monthly, the Atlantic magazine, put out this link where you could plug in your name and find, I think it was Meta's model, and find out if your work, if your book, my books, were used to train it. And I'll be honest with you, I was really relieved that every one of my books was listed. Again, this idea that, like, okay, I'd like a little bit of compensation for my work, but I think more importantly, like, I really wanted to think like, oh, okay, if you ask that model about what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, like, I help inform that. So that's my legacy. I'd like to be like informing the conversation long after I've gone on these various, on the internet, in the .com era. I wrote a couple of books around that. I'd like to think that I'm helping to shape that even after I'm done on this earth.
Yeah, totally, and beautiful. And I totally resonate with what you mentioned, and it reminded me of the famous quote by Dalai Lama: "Share your knowledge; it's a way to achieve immortality." And sharing, your knowledge, and you can achieve immortality. And it's an interesting way to see your life and legacy. And
Right.
totally resonate with that. Yeah, again, thank you so much for joining today. We really enjoyed, and learned a lot from you.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you.